The dense forest surrounding the cabin was always quiet at night, a peaceful solitude broken only by the whisper of the wind through the trees and the occasional call of an owl. It was the kind of place where people came to escape, to find solace in nature's embrace. That was exactly why Ethan's parents had chosen it. They wanted a fresh start, a home where their son could grow up away from the noise and dangers of the city. The house itself was old but sturdy, standing at the edge of the thick woods. Its wooden walls blended into the towering pines that stretched endlessly behind it. At first it had felt like a dream, but something was wrong. It started with a noise, not the kind that came and went, blending into the natural sounds of the night, but something distinct. A low, guttural growl that rumbled through the air like distant thunder. It wasn't loud enough to wake the entire house, but it was enough to make little Ethan stir in his sleep, enough to make him uneasy. He didn't understand what it was at first. He thought maybe it was part of a dream, a monster lurking in the dark corners of his mind. But when he opened his eyes, the sound was still there. It wasn't coming from inside his head, it was coming from outside his window. At breakfast, he told his parents. His mother smiled and brushed his hair back, telling him it was probably just the wind. His father agreed, reminding him that they lived in the woods now, and there were plenty of animals that roamed at night. It was nothing to worry about. Ethan wanted to believe them. He wanted to forget about the growling and go back to feeling safe in his room. But the sound came again the next night, and the night after that. At first it was faint, just a distant noise carried by the wind. But soon it became clearer, closer. Every night, at exactly midnight, the growling would begin. A deep and steady vibration in the air that sent chills crawling up his spine. It didn't sound like an ordinary animal. It wasn't the short, sharp bark of a fox or the yipping call of a coyote. It was deeper, heavier, more deliberate, like something massive lurking just beyond the darkness. Ethan began waking up in terror. He would pull his blanket up over his head, pressing his hands against his ears to block out the sound. But no matter how tightly he closed his eyes, he could still feel it. The presence outside his window, watching, waiting. It was always there, and it was getting worse. His parents dismissed it as his imagination, telling him that moving to a new place could be scary for a child. They assured him there was no reason to be afraid. They locked the doors at night, checked the windows, and even went outside during the day to look around. There was nothing there. But Ethan knew what he heard. He knew what he felt. And no matter what they said, he knew he wasn't imagining it. As the nights passed, his fear only grew. He refused to sleep alone, begging his mother to stay with him. He clung to her arm as she tucked him in, his wide eyes searching hers for reassurance. She did her best to calm him, but deep down, a small part of her wondered if something was truly wrong. She had heard the wind howl through the trees at night. She had heard the normal sounds of the forest. But once, just once, as she passed by Ethan's door on her way to bed, she thought she heard it too. The growling, faint but unmistakable. Still, she pushed the thought aside. It was probably just the house settling, or maybe a distant animal that sounded closer than it really was. But she couldn't ignore Ethan's growing distress. His face was pale, his little hands trembling whenever night fell. He had dark circles under his eyes from lack of sleep, and he barely spoke during the day. He was exhausted, terrified, and worst of all, he had stopped trying to convince them. He no longer told them about the growling, no longer begged them to listen. Instead, he simply stared out the window during the day, as if trying to understand something that none of them could see. Then one night, his mother made a decision. She would stay with him, not just until he fell asleep, but for the entire night. She needed to prove to him that there was nothing to be afraid of. The house was silent as she sat in the corner of Ethan's room, watching the soft rise and fall of his breathing as he finally drifted into sleep. Outside, the night stretched endlessly, wrapping the cabin in a thick blanket of darkness. She listened closely, waiting. The minutes passed, slow and heavy. Then it happened. At exactly midnight, the air around her seemed to shift. A deep, guttural growl rumbled through the walls, so low that she almost felt it before she heard it. Her body tensed, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the house settling. It was real, and it was right outside Ethan's window. Her heart pounded as she turned toward the glass. The darkness beyond was impenetrable, the trees standing like silent sentinels under the moon's dim glow. But even though she couldn't see anything, she felt it. The presence. It was there, watching. The growl came again, vibrating through the night air, deeper this time, more deliberate. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. It had to be an animal, a bear maybe. That was the logical explanation. But something about it felt different. Something about it felt wrong. She stood slowly, careful not to wake Ethan, and stepped closer to the window. The air was heavy, thick with something unspoken. She reached for the curtain, hesitating only for a moment before pulling it back. The darkness outside seemed endless, but somewhere beyond what she could see, something was waiting. The night passed slowly. Ethan's mother barely moved, barely breathed, her entire body frozen as she strained to listen. The growling outside the window did not fade. It came in steady waves, deep and deliberate, vibrating through the walls like a presence pressing in on them. She gripped the edge of Ethan's bed, torn between waking her husband and staying put, afraid that any movement might provoke whatever was out there. Minutes felt like hours. The sound would rise and then settle, as if something was pacing just beyond the reach of the dim porch light. Her fingers trembled as she finally reached for the curtain again, hoping, praying that she had only imagined it. She hadn't. The moonlight barely touched the tree line, but just beyond the shadows, she could make out something massive standing between the trunks. A figure too large to be anything but a bear. It was still, watching the house, its head slightly lowered, its breath forming faint puffs in the cold night air. Then, just as her eyes locked onto its dark shape, the growl came again, so deep she felt it in her chest. Her pulse pounded in her ears. It was just an animal, she told herself, a bear wandering through. But why was it here night after night, always outside Ethan's window? Bears did not behave like this. They moved through forests in search of food, shelter, or a safe place to rest. They did not stand watch over a house, did not return to the same place at the same time every night. The sound of rustling made her grip the windowsill even tighter. The bear was shifting, stepping forward, its massive body just barely visible in the dim glow of the sky. But then something strange happened. It didn't move toward the house. It turned its head, ears twitching, looking not at the window, but somewhere deeper into the woods. And then it stopped growling. The silence was worse. The absence of sound made the air feel even heavier, pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. The bear's posture was tense, its muscles stiff. It wasn't just standing there, it was alert, as if it had been waiting for something, or watching for something. A sudden chill crept down her spine, an eerie realization settling over her. The bear wasn't growling at them, it was growling at something else. She stepped back, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. The urge to wake her husband was overwhelming now. She turned, rushing toward the bedroom door, but just as her fingers reached the handle, a noise from outside stopped her. Not a growl. Something else. Something human. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the sound of the wind, but she heard it, a shuffle of footsteps against the dirt, the soft crunch of dried leaves under something, or someone's weight. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she turned back toward the window. The bear had not moved. It remained in the same position, its body rigid, its head still tilted toward the woods. Then, without warning, it let out a sharp huff, low and deliberate, a sound that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't a growl anymore. It was a warning. She rushed out of the room, her hands shaking as she pushed open her bedroom door. Her husband stirred as she grabbed his arm, her voice a harsh whisper as she shook him awake. He groaned, still half asleep, but when he saw her face, he sat up immediately. She didn't need to explain. The fear in her eyes told him everything. He followed her to Ethan's room, his movements slow, still groggy from sleep. But when the growl rumbled through the house again, low and steady, he stiffened. He stepped closer to the window, his body tense, his fingers hovering over the curtain as he hesitated. Then in one swift motion, he pulled it back. The bear was still there, but it was no longer looking into the woods. It was looking right at them. For a long moment, nobody moved. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock and the heavy weight of their own breathing. The bear's eyes, dark and unreadable, were locked onto theirs through the glass. Then, as if satisfied that it had been seen, it let out one final deep exhale before turning. Without another sound, it disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the darkness. Ethan's father let the curtain fall back into place, his expression tight. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. The silence between them was thick, the unanswered questions filling the air. The bear had come every night. It had stood outside their home, growling at something unseen. And now, just when they had finally acknowledged it, it had left. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. The next morning, as soon as the sun touched the treetops, Ethan's father went outside. He walked to the window where the bear had been standing, his boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. The air was crisp, the forest alive with the sounds of birds and distant rustling. But here, in this exact spot, something felt off. Then he saw them. Footprints, but not from a bear. The tracks in the dirt were different, longer, thinner, unmistakably human. They started near the tree line, moving closer to the house, stopping just beneath Ethan's window. His stomach twisted. Someone had been here, and the bear had known. Ethan's father stared at the footprints, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. The morning air was cold, but a different kind of chill crept up his spine as he followed the tracks. They weren't fresh, but they were distinct enough to be recent. They led straight to Ethan's window, stopping just beneath it. Whoever had stood there had done so for a long time. He swallowed hard, trying to push back the rising panic. His first thought was that it had to be a hiker, maybe someone lost in the woods. But no hiker would come this close to a house in the dead of night and then stand silently beneath a child's window. A sickening realization settled in his chest. Someone had been watching. His pulse pounded in his ears as he crouched down, tracing his fingers over the indents in the dirt. They weren't deep. Whoever had been there had moved cautiously, careful not to make noise. His gaze darted toward the forest, scanning the endless stretch of trees. Nothing moved. Nothing seemed out of place. But suddenly, the bear's behavior made sense. It hadn't been threatening them. It had been warning them. He hurried back inside, his face pale as he told his wife what he had found. Her expression twisted with fear, her eyes flickering toward Ethan, who sat at the kitchen table, swinging his legs absent-mindedly as he ate his breakfast. He was oblivious to the storm building around him. The parents exchanged glances. They needed answers. That afternoon, they called a local wildlife ranger, explaining the bear's behavior and the strange noises at night. The ranger listened carefully, but his response was not what they expected. He told them that, while bears were territorial, this kind of behavior was unusual. Bears don't guard houses, he said. They don't stand watch outside windows unless something is keeping them there. The words sent another wave of unease through them. Something had been keeping it there. The ranger advised them to be cautious, to secure their home at night and report anything suspicious. But his voice held an edge of uncertainty, as if he wasn't sure what they were dealing with. Before hanging up, he left them with one final warning. If that bear keeps coming back, it's not just a coincidence. You should trust its instincts. That night, the parents stayed awake. They locked every door and window, double-checked the security latches, and sat in the living room with the lights off, listening. Midnight came, and like clockwork, the growling returned. The sound was deep, vibrating through the floorboards, shaking them down to their bones. It wasn't coming from the trees this time. It was closer. Ethan's father clenched his fists, his pulse hammering as he slowly got up and grabbed a flashlight. He moved toward the window, his breath tight in his chest. With trembling fingers, he lifted the curtain. The bear was there. But this time, it wasn't alone. Its massive form was hunched low, shoulders tense, teeth bared. Its growl rumbled like thunder, but its eyes weren't fixed on the house. They were locked on something else. Ethan's father hesitated before shifting the beam of his flashlight toward the trees. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the thick underbrush. For a moment, there was nothing, just the endless stretch of the forest. Then something moved, a shadow, a figure standing between the trees. It was tall and motionless, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness. But the moment the light hit it, it reacted. It turned and ran. The bear let out an ear-splitting roar, lunging forward, crashing into the trees as it chased after the figure. Branches snapped, leaves rustled violently, and then silence. Ethan's father stood frozen, his hands shaking. He had seen enough. Someone had been watching their house. Someone had been watching their child, and the bear had been the only thing keeping them away. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan's father stood by the window, his body rigid, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The bear had vanished into the trees, its massive form swallowed by the shadows as it chased after the intruder. The forest was still again, but the damage was done. Someone had been watching them. Someone had been watching Ethan. His mind raced as he turned back toward his wife, who stood frozen near the staircase, her face pale. She had seen it too. The figure, the way it fled the moment the light found it, the way the bear had reacted, as if it had been expecting it. Neither of them spoke. There was no need for words. Ethan was still asleep upstairs, oblivious to the terror that had unfolded outside his window. The thought made his father's stomach turn. How many nights had someone been standing there, just beyond the reach of the porch light? How many nights had the bear growled, not out of aggression, but as a warning? His wife broke the silence first, her voice trembling as she whispered the question neither of them wanted to ask. What if the bear wasn't the threat? A cold shiver ran through him. That was the moment it all clicked. The bear had never tried to break in. It had never tried to harm them. It could have easily charged the house, torn through the thin walls, but it never did. Instead, it stood guard. It waited. It growled. Not to scare them, but to scare away whatever else was out there. Ethan's father grabbed his phone and called the police. He didn't care if they thought he was paranoid. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching their child. And if it hadn't been for the bear, they might have never known until it was too late. The police arrived within the hour, their flashlights sweeping through the property, their voices calm but firm as they asked questions. The officers took their statements, then moved toward the trees with caution, looking for any sign of movement. But whoever had been lurking outside was long gone. Still, there was proof. The officers found more footprints. They were human, large, deep impressions in the dirt, leading directly to Ethan's window. The tracks didn't wander, didn't hesitate. Whoever had made them had come with purpose. They had walked straight from the woods, stood beneath the glass, and waited. One officer knelt down, touching the marks in the earth before looking back at them. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was serious. These prints have been here for more than one night. The words sent a wave of nausea through Ethan's mother. Her hands shook as she pressed them to her mouth. This wasn't just a one-time thing. This wasn't some lost hiker stumbling too close to the house. Whoever had been here had been coming night after night. They had been watching Ethan for weeks. The officers searched the woods, but there were no signs of where the intruder had gone. The trees swallowed everything, concealing the escape route like a living shield. As the investigation continued, the officers asked about the bear. Ethan's father told them everything. The nightly growling, the way it had always appeared outside Ethan's room, the way it had reacted when the figure ran. The officers exchanged glances but didn't dismiss it. One of them, an older man who had spent years patrolling the area, nodded slowly. "Bears don't usually act like that," he murmured, "unless they're protecting something." The weight of those words settled over them like a heavy fog. For weeks they had feared the bear. They had locked their doors, whispered in hushed tones, flinched at the sound of its growls. But all along, it had been the one thing keeping them safe. Ethan's father exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He couldn't shake the image from his mind. The bear standing in the darkness, growling, refusing to leave, night after night. It had known something they didn't. It had sensed something sinister. The officers advised them to remain cautious, to report any further disturbances. They promised to patrol the area more frequently, to look into any recent reports of trespassers. But deep down, Ethan's parents knew the truth. Whoever had been out there would not stop just because the police had come once. That night, they made sure every door and window was locked. They kept the lights on. The house bathed in artificial warmth, but no amount of brightness could chase away the eerie feeling creeping through their bones. Then as the clock neared midnight, the growling returned. low, steady, right outside the window. But when Ethan's father pulled back the curtain, expecting to see the familiar dark silhouette of the bear, his breath hitched in his throat. The bear wasn't alone. It stood where it always did, its massive shoulders squared, its eyes locked on the tree line. But beyond it, just barely visible through the gaps in the branches, something else lurked. A figure, watching, waiting. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Ethan's father realized the bear wasn't growling to keep them safe anymore. It was growling because it knew whatever was out there was coming back. The growling was deeper than before, more aggressive, vibrating through the wooden walls of the house. Ethan's father stood frozen by the window, his breath caught in his throat. The bear remained outside, its posture rigid, muscles tensed, eyes locked onto the tree line. But it wasn't just watching anymore. It was ready. Whatever was lurking in the shadows had returned, and this time, the bear was not just warning, it was preparing for something worse. Ethan's mother stood behind him, clutching her arms, her entire body stiff with fear. Neither of them spoke as they stared into the dark forest, the tension thick between them. The trees barely swayed in the still night air, their silhouettes looming over the cabin like silent watchers. But deep within those shadows, something was there. A shape, tall, unmoving, just out of reach of the porch light. The air inside the house felt suffocating, thick with dread. Ethan remained asleep upstairs, unaware of the nightmare unfolding outside his window. His father clenched his fists, his mind racing. He couldn't just stand there. He had to act. He grabbed a flashlight, his pulse hammering against his ribs as he stepped toward the front door. His wife grabbed his wrist, shaking her head furiously, her eyes pleading. But he couldn't ignore this any longer. The police had searched the area but found nothing. The bear had been the only thing keeping this person at bay. And if they didn't do something, if they continued to hide behind their locked doors, what would stop them from coming closer? The door creaked open, and the cold air rushed in. The night was eerily silent, apart from the bear's deep growls. Ethan's father stepped onto the porch, gripping the flashlight with white knuckles. He shone the beam toward the woods, sweeping it across the trees. For a moment there was nothing, just the endless stretch of forest, empty and unmoving. Then the light landed on something, a figure, standing just beyond the first row of trees, a tall, thin man in dark clothing. His face was obscured by the shadows, but his stance was unnatural, rigid, almost lifeless. He wasn't moving, wasn't even blinking, just standing there, staring straight at the house, straight at Ethan's window. The flashlight shook slightly in Ethan's father's hand as a rush of adrenaline surged through him. He expected the man to run like before, to disappear into the night the moment he was seen. But this time he didn't. He just stood there, watching. Then slowly he tilted his head, a sickening, deliberate motion, as if amused. A low rumble filled the air. The bear. Its growls grew louder, more urgent. The moment stretched unbearably, the weight of the unseen threat pressing down on Ethan's father like a suffocating blanket. Then without warning, the bear lunged forward. The massive creature barreled toward the figure, its roar echoing through the night. The man moved, not in panic, not in fear, but in a way that sent ice-cold terror through Ethan's father's veins. Fast, too fast. One moment he was standing there, the next he was gone, vanished into the trees, swallowed by the forest as if he had never been there at all. The bear crashed into the underbrush, but the intruder had already disappeared. The forest returned to silence. Ethan's father stood there, chest heaving, flashlight beam shaking as he swept it desperately through the trees. There was nothing. No sound of retreating footsteps, no sign of movement. The man had vanished. The bear stood at the edge of the woods, its massive body rising and falling with deep breaths. It didn't chase any further. Instead, it turned, exhaling sharply before walking back toward the cabin. It paused near the porch, its dark eyes meeting Ethan's father's for the first time. There was no hostility in them, no wild aggression, just something almost knowing. Then, without another sound, the bear lumbered away into the night. Ethan's father backed into the house, slamming the door shut. His wife stood in the hallway, hands covering her mouth, eyes filled with unspeakable horror. He locked the door, bolting it twice before sagging against the wall. They didn't sleep that night. Neither of them spoke. They just sat there, listening to the silence, wondering if the man would return, wondering what would have happened if the bear hadn't been there. By morning, the tracks were gone. The forest floor was undisturbed, as if no one had ever stood beneath Ethan's window, as if none of it had been real, but they knew better. And they knew one thing for certain: the bear had not been their enemy. It had been the only reason they were still safe. Morning arrived with a thick fog hanging over the trees, wrapping the forest in an eerie silence. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on Ethan's parents, exhaustion settling deep into their bones. Neither had slept, their ears attuned to every creak, every rustling leaf, every imagined sound that might signal the return of the figure in the woods. But the night had remained quiet. As the sun slowly filtered through the mist, Ethan remained unaware of the horrors that had unfolded outside his window. His parents sat in the living room, tense and silent, waiting for the police to arrive. When the officers finally pulled into the driveway, their presence did little to ease the fear gripping their chests. They explained everything: the bear's relentless growling, the footprints beneath the window, the figure in the trees, and the way it had fled unnaturally fast when the bear charged. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions shifting from skepticism to quiet concern. They had heard strange reports before: sightings of unknown people lurking near remote homes, eerie disturbances in the woods, but never anything quite like this. One officer walked the perimeter of the house while another inspected the ground near the window. But just like before, the tracks had disappeared, erased by the damp earth and shifting leaves. It was as if no one had ever been there, no proof, no sign. But Ethan's father knew what he had seen, and more than that, he knew the bear had seen it too. The officers assured them they would increase patrols in the area, but there was little else they could do. Without evidence, without a suspect, the case remained open-ended. All they could offer was a warning: stay vigilant, lock the doors, and don't ignore the instincts of the wildlife around them. That final statement lingered in Ethan's father's mind. The officers might not have believed in the bear's role in what had happened, but he did. It wasn't just some random animal wandering too close to the house. It had been protecting them, protecting Ethan. That evening, after the officers left, the house felt different. The walls seemed thinner. The doors felt weaker. The sense of security they had once had in this place was gone. And worst of all, the bear did not return. For the first time in weeks, there was no growling at midnight, no heavy presence outside the window, no warning. The night stretched on in silence, and with it came a realization far more terrifying than any noise in the dark. The bear had been keeping the danger away, and now it was gone. Ethan's mother sat awake, her fingers curled tightly around a mug of untouched tea. Her husband paced the room, glancing toward the window every few minutes as if expecting to see something standing there. But nothing came. They had spent so many nights fearing the bear, worrying about what it wanted, thinking it was the danger lurking outside their home. But now, with its absence, the house felt exposed, vulnerable. As the hours crawled by, they heard it. Not a growl, not a bear. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, right outside Ethan's window. Ethan's father's breath caught in his throat. He reached for the flashlight with shaking hands, moving toward the window with the same dread that had gripped him the night before. He hesitated, his fingers brushing against the curtain. Then, in the stillness of the night, something tapped on the glass, a single, deliberate tap. Ethan's mother gasped, covering her mouth to stifle a scream. The air in the house seemed to vanish, a suffocating fear pressing in on them. Ethan's father gritted his teeth, yanking the curtain aside. Nothing. The porch light illuminated an empty yard, the trees swaying gently in the distance. But the moment he looked down, his blood ran cold. A handprint, smudged against the glass, large, thin, unmistakably human. His pulse thundered in his ears. The house was not safe. The bear had been the only thing standing between them and this, and now it was gone. Ethan's mother pulled him back from the window, her breathing uneven, her hands gripping his arm like a vice. They couldn't stay here, not with something lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment the bear was no longer there to stop it. By sunrise, they had packed their bags. The decision had been made. They wouldn't wait for another night, wouldn't wait for the growling that would never come. The house, once their sanctuary, had become something else, a trap. As they loaded the car, Ethan stood by the window, his small hands pressed against the glass, his eyes scanning the trees. He didn't understand why they were leaving so suddenly. He didn't understand the fear in his parents' eyes. But as they drove away, disappearing down the winding dirt road, Ethan glanced back one last time, and there, standing just beyond the trees, watching silently, was the bear. It had returned, but it had stopped growling. The story of the bear's growls was far more than just a warning. It was a shield against something unseen, something lurking in the shadows. But what happens when the protector is gone? Some mysteries remain unsolved, buried in the silence of the forest. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more gripping stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that makes you question what might be watching in the dark.